When society signals to you that your language, when society signals to you that your former colonial power's language is more important, when it tells you to abandon your saris, kurtas, and hijabs, when it tells you that Eurocentric values are gospel, when it tells you that these values are the Bible, that they tell you that your language is in fact inferior and culturally less important than English, we begin to observe a societal subservience to modern colonial expressions. We do not stand with Western cultural hegemony. The burden of today's debate was proving to you that why having English as a primary means of instructions is principally damaging to both individual and societal cultural identity, along with the practical fact that funding this and providing the resources for this is entirely infeasible and makes other essential infrastructure and educational development the opportunity cost. So I have 2 points of clash for this the House today. Well, firstly, which side of the House actually provides better educational and GDP outcomes? And secondly, which side of the House actually preserves this cultural aspects more? Now let's start with what our House told you. Our House came in and told you that, okay, we recognize that English is important, we recognize that equality is important, and we recognize that economic development is important. And the opposition agrees with that as well, right? But we also tell you that it's not feasible, well, firstly because these developing countries are poor. We characterize them as poor, corrupt, we tell you that they're likely to be corrupt, and there's likely to be a class divide. Therefore, it will be difficult to fund finding these qualified, educated teachers internationally and locally and providing education in this instance to make sure that English is taught as a primary means of instruction. Okay, right? Because we know that not only English teachers need to learn English, but in fact geography, math, and every other subject need to know English. And this requires a complete revamp of the educational system, which is very, very expensive and unaffordable for these developing countries. Now, the opposition boldly claims that learning English magically transforms your country from being dirt poor to being developed and rich, right? This is entirely false. Now, first they tell us that we achieve this educational efficient outcome. And then they give us an incorrect characterization of developing countries as having stagnating development, right? No, developing countries don't have stagnating development. Let me give you the example of the mighty China that in fact has English as a secondary language and has transformed from being a dirt poor country to one of the richest countries in the world today. Now, we also recognize that educational efficiency is not achieved in the opposition side of the House due to firstly having a shortage of educated and qualified teachers who know English to a suitable degree to teach as a primary means of instruction. And secondly, if we do hire teachers internationally, we have cultural boundaries. We have in fact boundaries that whether these teachers actually want to come to this developing country to work on a lower salary and work in an environment that is likely to be poorer or having poorer infrastructure. Now they also tell you that English has internationally available resources that can be distributed and everyone can suddenly magically understand these resources and put them into the classroom. Now let me give you a scenario. You have a math teacher who has never learned, who knows basic kindergarten English, right? And you expect her to go on to a website. Firstly, okay, you need to assume that this developing country has high-speed access to high-speed internet and international boards such as IB and Cambridge. And then you need them to suddenly implement and learn all of this content and magically transform their classroom from a Swahilian or a Hindi classroom to an English classroom, right? So we see that this is not feasible, and these assumptions are too bold to make in the next 10 to 20 years, as the opposition would otherwise claim. We also tell you that these countries have minimal access to technology and Wi-Fi and broadband, and therefore it actually would not work. And this limited access to technology would in fact be better that we provide greater aspects of infrastructure to the educational facilities like bathrooms, water, and better tables and chairs than instead wasting money to make sure that every single teacher in the short term knows English, when in fact these students need a classroom first to learn before they actually bother learning English. Now they also tell you that we achieve educational equality and then we achieve national development through education. Now we entirely agree with that education is a very important aspect of a country's development. Well, they firstly gave us no link as to why English enables greater equality. Well, yes, educational improvements are necessary, but we tell you, in fact, otherwise, that English does not enable educational equality because these individuals who learn English learn suitable forms of English due to the fact that elite universities, elite schools are more likely to be prioritized and funded. We see a class divide that no, there is no educational equality. You see that the wealthy people are more educated and know English better, so that they can use these resources to migrate out of the country and drain the country of its brain power. And then we see these poorer individuals who don't have access to quality English education. Therefore, what do we have? We don't have educational equality because poorer schools have poorer quality teachers that don't know proper English. So how are they going to teach these curriculums in the first place? So we see, yes, that in your side of the house is in fact educational inequality, not equality. right? And then they tell us that in the long term, somehow, that there will be an integration of English. Well, what are we speaking of? 50 years, 100 years, 500 years? By the time you're dead, do we have time to make these deep transformations of norms and conformities in the time when, in fact, that little kid needs food on his plate, and he doesn't, in fact, need to learn English at this very moment, because if he doesn't get his food, he won't be able to concentrate in his math class, right? The opposition doesn't understand the priorities in this debate. The priorities are not to make sure that the elite learn English and can migrate out of the country and can suddenly transform this country into a magical powerhouse. No, we need the poorer, larger proportion of the population to have food, have tables, have whiteboards, right? And then, secondly, they love to claim points that are entirely not mutually exclusive. Well, they tell us with the bilingual point, well, we tell you we claim that as well. We will make English a secondary language. We will reap all the benefits of having bilingualism. We'll reap all the benefits of them being more critically advanced. We also tell you that in fact, they tell us that these resources and university opportunities will be available for everyone, but our side of the house tells you and proves to you why that these resources and opportunities will only be available to the upper classes, right? And then they also tell us that somehow human capital will be improved. How will it be improved, firstly? You don't mechanize that to us. And secondly, we tell you that human capital will in fact not be improved because these higher elite institutes will get more funding, and instead we see a growing disparity between the wealthy and the lower classes, right? And then they somehow magically claim to us that brain drain will not occur in their scenario, and brain drain is in fact short-term. Well, if brain drain was short-term, countries in Northern Africa and Southern Africa would be rich by now, right? We don't recognize the fact that brain drain is short-term. Brain drain is not a short-term issue. And this is why we win this point of clash, because we tell you that firstly there'll be a government, in fact, a fear of debt, because they have to fund these institutions, and then there'll be also greater educational and wealth inequality, as elite students are more likely to learn English in more qualified and quality institutions. And we also tell you that there won't be integration of English into this country, because it would rather be a very, very, very long term, which is not the current priority. It's in fact providing normal, suitable education to these individuals. Now, second point of clash of the culture, we tell you that neo-colonialism will occur, right? The government sanctioned English as a priority, right? The opposition tells you that we'll be able to accommodate different languages as somehow of a token tool, right? They use it as a token element, as an informal way to solely celebrate this need to celebrate a secondary inferior language. They don't recognize that values transform to be Eurocentric. We see ideals, especially in countries like India, where parents try to incorporate English as much as in school as out of school. We see them trying to speak it as much in the home, right? We see an erosion of cultural heritage. We see that, okay, these parents don't want their kids wearing traditional Indian or traditional native clothes. They want them to speak English. They don't want them to eat with their hands. They want them to eat with forks and knives, right? We see this loss of cultural erosion. The opposition says that the native language is not bad. Okay, you don't ban the native language, but by coercing this developing population into believing that their language is not important, makes them subservient to Western hegemony. And this is why we are proud to negate it.